The Civil War changed the economy in America by creating a more business-focused environment. Before the war, the country was divided between the North and South, who each had two very different economies. The South relied on agriculture and the North had an industrial-based system, but after the war, many people abandoned the agricultural ways of the South and migrated to large industrial cities like New York. The country began to grow as railroads were built and companies expanded. People began to earn large amounts of money and their savings grew. Some people took advantage of their savings and began to build business empires, and these advancements defined the business element of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age era launched an economic theory called laissez-faire capitalism. Business advocates wanted to limit government involvement in the economy, and they wanted a pure market, which was a market controlled completely by independent businesses. They wanted to control trade on their own so they could make as much profit as possible. But the United States could never truly achieve a pure market, as the government had to make many interferences to break strikes and give subsidies just to keep the economy from going under. Laissez-faire linked to a second economic theory known as social Darwinism. This theory emerged from Charles Darwin's rule of natural selection as people began to believe in the survival of the fittest in the political climate. This theory came about in the 1880s, though it declined later on in history as it provided justification for imperialism and conservatism. Social Darwinism did not acknowledge the inherent advantage held by non-minorities and therefore has been condemned for its racist principles. Through social Darwinism, the most fit individuals were the ones who were capable of accumulation of power and wealth in business. The business advocates of the Gilded Age were able to get their ambitions from a man named Horatio Alger, an author of the late 19th century. They followed the Horatio Alger myth, which was a mindset derived from his writings, which all promoted the rags to riches theme. This inspired young men to work hard to achieve wealth and a higher status in society.
Businesses were run in different ways throughout the Gilded Age. One of the forms certain businesses took was a monopoly. This is when businesses would make sure that they were the dominant company in an industry, so all of the customers would come to them, and they wouldn't have to worry about competitors. But the government didn't approve of monopolies, which is why they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This act let the federal government intervene with business activity to break up any monopolies they saw as threatening. Another way businesses were run was through a corporate trust. This was when businesses would cooperate with each other to get more profit. Smaller companies would give their stock to bigger, more dominating companies in exchange for a trust, so they could receive some of the profits. This let more companies get more profits by eliminating competitors. Pools were another strategy companies used to organize their businesses. Pools were used when companies would make agreements to share some of their profits, increase or decrease their prices, or divide the market for their products. All of these strategies would increase profits for each company. No company was legally bound to the pools, so they could drop out if they felt it was necessary. Pools were very popular among U.S. companies, and they were used to fund projects such as railroads.
Interlocking directorate was a strategy used by entrepreneurs where companies would take their men to the boards of competing companies to get information from the competition and use it to their advantage. It wasn't a bad thing at first, but then companies started scamming others by transferring all the benefits to one company and the other would go bankrupt as a result. The government eventually made this illegal. Interlocking directorate led to scandals like the Credit Mobilier. The Union Pacific Railroad Company was creating a transcontinental railroad, but they were involved with the Credit Mobilier and did not say that that company was supplying them with materials. UPR went bankrupt, which led to bad publicity for Credit Mobilier, and they tried to bribe congressmen by offering them a percentage of their shares.
There were two types of entrepreneurs in the Gilded Age: robber barons and captains of industry. Robber barons were men that would let nothing stand in the way of getting to the top, even if it meant using inhumane practices to support their business. They wouldn't give their workers good and safe working conditions or fair wages, and they would often develop a monopoly. Three important robber barons were J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and John D. Rockefeller. Morgan created the first billion-dollar company in America, which was the U.S. Steel Corporation. He monopolized the steel industry and was able to gain control of half of the country's railroad mileage. He was very hard on his workers and gave them less than $1 every day. Workplace deaths were also a problem in his companies, and he had little regard for worker safety. Vanderbilt was a dominating figure in the steamship industry and became the largest steamship operator in the U.S., which benefited the Union during the Civil War. He was able to monopolize his companies by buying out all other companies in his industry. He provided large amounts of people with jobs, but was still an overall greedy man. He didn't pay his workers well and never donated money. He only gave $1 million to Vanderbilt University. Rockefeller was a businessman from Richford, New York, who founded the Standard Oil Company. While running this business, Rockefeller used a trust, and Standard Oil Company became the first business to do so. Rockefeller's robber baron ways led him to treat his workers poorly by giving them low and unfair wages. His business also became a monopoly in the oil industry, and it bought out all other oil companies that existed in the late 1800s.
John D. Rockefeller was also important because he is one of the most significant people to use a strategy of horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is controlling the market and creating a monopoly by joining with competitors. Companies would acquire others in the same field to decrease competition and increase revenue. Using this strategy and creating a monopoly in the oil industry was what gave Rockefeller a majority of his earnings.
Robber barons were not the only types of entrepreneurs. There were also captains of industry. Captains of industry were more caring than robber barons. They would find ways to benefit society through their businesses and would give better jobs to people who needed them. The most important captain of industry in the Gilded Age was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was able to make money through Carnegie Steel Co. Prior, he worked as a division superintendent of Penn Railroad, where he invested in ventures like steel and oil, and was able to make his first fortune. After that, Carnegie Steel was bought for $480 million, making Carnegie one of the richest men in the world. Carnegie was much more humane than the robber barons, as he donated $350 million to libraries and scientific research. He also established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the New York Public Library. But he still did not treat his workers fairly, as he attempted to lower worker wages at steel plants, leading to the Homestead Act and multiple deaths.
One of Carnegie's greatest achievements was his use of the strategy of vertical integration. He was the first man to bring vertical integration into the business world. Vertical integration is controlling the production line to make as much profit as possible. It controls all phases of making the product, from first receiving the materials to marketing them to customers. This is seen in mining and shipping. Companies will acquire more companies to strengthen the production line and cut costs. Carnegie used this method because he wanted to eliminate the middleman so the product would be more reliable in the aspect of quality.
Another way Carnegie made a lasting impact on the Gilded Age business was through his article, called Gospel Wealth. This article was written in June 1889 and stated that the wealthy have responsibility to contribute to society. It promoted the wealthy to use their wealth responsibly and to narrow the gap between the rich and poor. It argues against inheritance, as Carnegie believed heirs with large fortunes would spend their money recklessly on themselves instead of working to better social mobility. This article was revolutionary for the time, as it painted Carnegie as a man working towards a better American social and economic environment rather than a greedy businessman.